Hey guys, today I want to go over AP Biology's Unit 8, which is Ecology. Now, ecology starts off with responses to the environment. A couple examples might be the photo period of a plant, which is going to be the plant responding to the length of daylight hours. So, flowering or producing fruit would be a good example. Phototrophism is the actual bending of a plant towards the sunlight. A couple other examples would be taxis, which is going to be the movement of a organism towards a stimulus. So for this example, we have a planaria more moving towards the light. Kinesis would be another one, which is basically increasing or decreasing movement based off of a stimulus, and that's typically going to be a random movement. So this pill bug or roly poly trying to get out of the sunlight, try to get into a dark, moist area. Herbivory would be another example. That could be where a plant becomes either poisonous whenever it's ingested or producing, let's say, thorns to actually keep from predators eating it. A couple other examples would be aposematic coloration, which is going to be the bright coloration in organisms to prevent themselves from being eaten, kind of demonstrates that they are poisonous. Batesian mimicry is another good example. That's where the coral snake and the king snake, that's where two organisms are going to resemble each other. Typically, a venomous organism will exist and a non venomous organism will try to mimic the coloring patterns of that organism to help evade predators. A couple other good examples might be the fight or flight coloration, again, going back to the Batesian mimicry. You could also have the territory markings, songs, chemicals, pheromones, different things like that that might increase an organism's survival. Good thing to keep in mind that these responses to the environment are going to increase the organism's chances of survival. Another good topic in ecology is going to be energy flow and different strategies that allow organisms to exist. So, the flow of energy is always from autotroph to heterotroph. 100% of the energy exists at the autotrophic level, and very little, almost 90%, is lost. So, very little actually gets transferred to the heterotrophic level, roughly 10%. A couple of different examples of autotrophs would be photoautotrophs that use sunlight or chemoautotrophs that use inorganic chemicals such as hydrogen sulfide, talking about bacteria typically there. Heterotrophs can be many different types, but herbivory, eating plants, omnivore, both, carnivore, just meat, and detrivores, breaking down dead organic material. Those are just a couple of different examples. But the big difference is autotrophs are going to make their own energy, whereas heterotrophs have to consume other um, organisms in order to obtain their energy. A couple strategies for existence would be like if you're cold blooded or warm blooded. So, ectotherms are going to be cold blooded organisms. They're not going to dedicate much of their metabolism to regulating their body heat. Therefore, they usually don't have to eat as often. Whereas endotherms or warm blooded organisms are going to dedicate a lot of their metabolism, a lot of their calories to warming their body temperature. And that's going to require that they eat quite often. R and K strategists tend to deal with how they have their offspring. So an R strategist is going to be something that has a high death rate and a low life expectancy. So amphibians or cold-blooded organisms are really good examples. Fish, something that has a whole bunch of eggs, but really dedicates very little, if any, of its energy to actually raising those young. So they're going to have a high death rate, and they typically don't live very long. Whereas a K strategist is going to be like warm blooded organisms, mammals especially, where they're going to have a typically low death rate, and they're going to have a high life expectancy. A lot of their energy goes into raising their young and making sure that they do survive to older age. When it comes to population ecology, you're going to have a couple different equations. Something that I should point out is that you're going to have the population size, you're going to have the change in time, birth rate, death rate. A couple of these letters that you'll see, R, which is going to be the growth rate of the population, and K being the carrying capacity. Those are all going to come into play depending on the question that you're given. And something that I tell students is make sure that you know that the growth rate is going to be this, the N over T. So growth rate equals births minus your deaths. When it comes to exponential growth equals your growth rate of the population times the population size. And exponential growth, if you remember, is going to be a J curve. It's going to have really rapid increase in population size. Whereas logistical growth That's going to be the S curve, and that's going to be the one that factors in the carrying capacity. So you'll notice in the equation that carrying capacity is included, and that is on your formula sheet. So you definitely want to be careful and make sure you do understand those. When it comes to density limits, pretty much the number of organisms in a given unit area, you're going to have density dependent factors and density independent factors. Density dependent depend on the numbers of organisms. So if you think about it, as you increase the number of organisms, things such as disease, competition for any resources, predation, they're all going to increase as well. There's a direct relationship there. And a lot of times they're going to be biotic factors within your ecosystem or living factors. Density independent factors, on the other hand, they're typically going to be abiotic factors. They're going to be occurring no matter, regardless of the population size. So, weather, seasons, climate, they're all good examples of density independent factors. They are independent of the density. Um, Community ecology is going to be a little bit different. That one's going to be dealing with symbiotic relationships and how, as a community, these ecosystems exist. You're going to have something called Simpson's Diversity Index, and that's going to be an equation that's on your formula sheet. Just take note of what they actually stand for. Usually, you're going to be doing 1 minus the summation, and what you'll be given is a data table, and it'll have like a certain number of organisms of one species. And then it goes through a bunch of different types of species. So, one thing that you'll want to be able to figure out is what is the total number of all organisms, of all species of that particular ecosystem. And that's going to be represented by the capital N and the little n. It is a fairly redundant equation because you're going to be taking the summation of this. So let's say the number of squirrels over the entire population squared, and then the number of snakes in a population over the total number squared, and the number of any other organism over the entire population. So you're going to have a bunch of those, and then you're going to add them all up. That's what the summation sign's for. But do make sure that you do the 1 minus that total number that you get whenever you do those calculations. That's a good hint. When it comes to symbiotic relationships, they're going to be listed various ways, but parasitism is one example. That's where one benefits, the other one's pretty much harmed. Also, take note that parasites typically don't kill their host. Mutualism is going to be a positive positive. That's where both species benefit. And then commensalism is going to be where one organism benefits and the other one's neither helped nor harmed. Biodiversity is key to this ecology unit. Keeping in mind that biodiversity and ecosystem diversity, genetic diversity, they're all going to help organisms survive, and they're also going to help them survive when it comes to changes in their environment. It gives them resilience. Keystone species are also a very important organism to mention when it comes to biodiversity. They're going to be organisms that have a high impact on the ecosystem. And basically, whenever they're removed, the ecosystem collapses. So I have a couple examples: the wolf, the beaver, the shark, and the sea star. But pretty much whenever you remove those from an ecosystem, there's going to be a dramatic effect on that ecosystem. And there's also disruptions to the ecosystems. That's where we finish up with. Invasive species are going to be organisms that are introduced into an area by accident, typically. And the bad thing about them is that they typically don't have any competition, so they'll overrun these ecosystems completely, whether it's the lionfish or the kudzu vines that drowned out all the trees, zebra mussels. You could even go into the Florida pythons and how these snakes, they don't have natural predators. They typically end up consuming all the resources, and they have a negative effect on all the other organisms that are in that particular ecosystem. Human impacts could really vary depending on where you might be. So logging or the removal of certain habitats might be an example. Urbanization or the building of cities that might cause ecosystem fragmentation, might divide up their ecosystems and prevent them from getting to certain areas. Climate change, that can be attributed a lot of times to natural phenomenon, as well as the burning of fossil fuels. So the combustion of these fossil fuels releases carbon dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas, which may contribute to climate change. Resistance could be another one. Maybe humans inadvertently promote resistance of a pesticide by overspraying it, or an insecticide, the introduction of a disease into an area, the production of certain chemicals. They're all going to have impacts on the ecosystem in some shape or form. Then there's also more natural, like geological, meteorological. So continental drift, El Nino, or the warming trends. meteor impacts. These are all going to be ways that ecosystems can be affected. And that concludes our ecosystem unit. I hope that was helpful.